If it's Tuesday, the key midterm races are tightening, and time is running out for both parties to clarify their closing messages and get out the vote. Plus, anti-Semitism in America, new fallout for Kanye West after his recent incendiary comments as concerns over racist rhetoric on the campaign trail heats up in the final days ahead of the midterms. And President Biden gets boosted amid new data showing the true cost of COVID for kids in classrooms and looming fears of a triple-demic. We will explain. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Kristen Welker. Election Day is just 2 weeks from today, and that means the campaigns are sharpening their closing messages, focusing on what and who will get voters to the polls. According to a source familiar with the matter, plans are coming together for President Biden and former President Obama to head to Pennsylvania to campaign for Senate candidate John Fetterman and gubernatorial candidate Josh Shapiro in the coming days. The details have not been finalized, but that is a big show of force in a state Democrats really want and frankly need to win. Right now, early voting is underway in 36 states, so there's a very good chance if you're watching this, you may now be able to vote. And our partners at Target Smart say that more than 9.5 million Americans have already cast their ballot, with tens of millions more expected to pull the lever over the next 14 days. Now, polls showing the economy and inflation as a top concern for voters. Some Democrats are shifting their messaging in these final days, adding an economic angle to their focus on abortion rights. Democratic groups are airing ads like this one in a Minnesota toss-up district. Take a look.
Angie Craig is getting things done. Angie Craig helped pass the law letting Medicare negotiate lower prescription drug prices and is leading the fight to cap the price of insulin at $35 a month. Tyler Kistner's priority? Taking away women's rights. Tyler Kistner says he's 100% pro-life and supports letting states ban abortion with no exceptions for rape, incest, or to save a woman's life.
Now, the question of closing messages is especially key in two pivotal Senate races. We're talking about Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, where progressives, Mandela Barnes and John Fetterman, are trying to prove that they are electable, even as they both get hit hard over their past positions on issues like crime and law enforcement. As my NBC News colleagues report, progressive candidates have struggled for years to win primaries in battleground states, facing criticism that they were too far left to win a general election. And all eyes will be on Pennsylvania tonight for the first and only debate between Fetterman and Republican Senate nominee Mehmet Oz. The Fetterman campaign put out a memo last night seriously lowering expectations as their candidate is still struggling with some speech and auditory processing issues following that stroke in May. He will be using closed captioning system to debate with Oz. Now, the candidate talked about his challenges, his recovery, and what it means for his campaign at an event over the weekend.
Understand everything in terms of on words, on paper, and understand what I hear. But when we're talking about very specific and having things like this, we're going to need captioning. Some people, it might be, they were maybe critical about it or like, wow, what's going on here? And I would remind people that, half of Americans use captioning when they watch television. Without a doubt, we do have issues. And I've been able to connect with people just stopping on the way on the Turnpike Plaza. I had two people stop me, and they shared their own issues and understanding.
Well, the stage is set. Joining me now ahead of tonight's Pennsylvania Senate debate is NBC News correspondent Dasha Burns in Harrisburg, and in battleground Wisconsin is NBC News correspondent Shaquille Brewster, where early voting begins today. Dasha, I have to start with you. We are just hours away from this high-stakes race between Dr. Oz and John Fetterman, and Fetterman's camp sent out that really extraordinary memo trying to lower expectations. Let me read a little bit more of that. It says, quote, John is going to win this race even if he doesn't win the debate. Dasha, look, there's lowering expectations, and then there's this memo. Talk a little bit more about the strategy inside the campaign and what you'll be watching for tonight.
Yeah, Kristen, look, this might be the most consequential, most anticipated moment of the midterms. Look, these are candidates that have been battling it out on the airwaves here in Pennsylvania and on the internet, which we've all seen. And voters I've been talking to all across the Commonwealth say they have been eagerly waiting to see them face to face on the debate stage, talking about the issues they care about. But what to expect? Well, you read some of it there. The Fetterman campaign putting out that memo, also saying in that memo, we'll admit this isn't John's format, saying if we're all being honest, Oz clearly comes into Tuesday night with a huge built-in advantage. And Oz, as you may remember, has pushed for more than one debate here. This is a TV doctor. This is definitely much more his forte than it is Fetterman's. You know, he struggled in primary debates as well. The campaign also pointed to the circumstances of the debate, calling them unprecedented, talking about the closed captioning you mentioned there that Fetterman will be using because of those lingering auditory processing issues, Kristen. So you'll see monitors behind the moderators. There will be live human transcription going on throughout the debate. It is going to be very interesting to see how Oz handles Fetterman's health, how Fetterman does, considering the challenges he's been facing, and really the issues that these candidates drill down on, Kristen.
Dasha, I'm curious, is the campaign concerned about those optics that you've talked about? And of course, you were the first reporter to reveal that he does still use closed captioning.
Well, they had spoken about needing closed captioning for the debate. Those were in the terms that Oz and the Fetterman team had agreed upon before finalizing this date and this debate. But look, this is clearly something that the campaign is concerned about. They've put out this memo, but they also are sort of saying, look, the debates aren't where Fetterman shines. He's an on-the-ground kind of politician that spends time with voters in Pennsylvania and does appeal to voters that a lot of Democrats have a hard time reaching. So it's going to be interesting to see. And on the transparency front, you know, you talk to different voters and they have very different expectations about that. And I'll be excited to talk to and follow up with some of the undecided voters that I've been speaking with after the debate tonight.
Yeah, we'll be looking forward to your coverage and those interviews, Dasha, for sure. Look, we are just learning that plans are coming together for President Biden and former President Obama to be campaigning together in Pennsylvania in the closing days of this race. It comes as Politico reports that Republicans are pouring money into the Oz race. Bottom line here, Dasha, you are at ground zero, right? Both sides are laser focused on Pennsylvania.
Yeah, Kristen, I think both sides believe that if they win Pennsylvania, they win the Senate. So this is a critical time to step up funding, step up spending on both sides here. You're seeing this last-minute rush to really help boost those candidates. For Republicans, I think they're seeing, you know, those numbers tightening here, and they want to give Oz a boost. And Democrats, they're bringing in the big guns with Biden and with Obama, really focusing on this final stretch that's going to be so critical. A lot of voters we've talked to are just now really starting to pay attention here. So these next couple of weeks could make a big difference, Kristen.
All right, Dasha Burns, late night for you tonight, but we look forward to your coverage. Thank you so much for that. Shaq, I have to turn to you because you are at another hot spot, Wisconsin, early voting beginning today. What are candidates saying in their closing messages? And of course, they're just off of the heels of a big fiery debate there in Wisconsin.
Exactly, and this is the first day of early voting. Before 9 a.m. when polls actually opened, you had 250,000 people already cast a ballot by mail. But this is the time when candidates and voters can come out and vote in person. And I mentioned candidates there because we saw Mandela Barnes, the Democratic candidate for Senate here in the state of Wisconsin. We saw at 9 a.m. as soon as polls opened, he went out and cast his ballot in Milwaukee. But you're also seeing Republicans push the message of voting early as well. I just left an event with Senator Ron Johnson, who was also telling his supporters to get out and vote early, despite the fact that he says he likes going on Election Day, so he's going to wait a little bit for that. But I want you to listen to a little bit of what we're hearing about how the candidates are shaping this message in terms of turnout, because so many people say it's turnout that's going to be the difference here. 2020, they were able to use drop boxes. This time, they're not allowed to use that. What kind of impact do you think they'll have?
Well, like I said, they were used in 2020. They weren't used in previous cycles. And the enthusiasm that people have, we'll be able to overcome it. People can return the ballots in the mail. They can show up places just like this to get their votes counted.
We really do want to encourage everybody to get out and vote early, get your vote in, and then not only do we not have to keep bugging you, we won't be on your back, but that will also allow you to maybe even volunteer as an observer.
You heard me ask there about drop boxes. In Wisconsin, the election administration is different than what we saw just 2 years ago. Those drop boxes that were placed in libraries and parks throughout the state that the Milwaukee Elections Commissioner told me was used by more than half the people who voted by mail. Well, this conservative Supreme Court here struck that down. Those are no longer allowed. There are also limitations to what clerks can do if someone does an incomplete address, for example. So the big message that you're hearing from folks is follow the rules as they are now. If that means voting early in person, do that. And if you're voting by mail, have those ballots returned early.
Yeah, and Shaq, a new CNN poll of likely voters shows that Johnson has a 1-point lead over Barnes. This is a very close race. What are both sides saying about their chances here?
It's an extremely close race, and that's something you're hearing from both sides in this race. You know, there's reasons to distrust the polling here in the state of Wisconsin, especially. It was back in 2016 when Johnson was running for his second term in office. He was behind in nearly every single poll before Election Day, with the exception of one. He ended up winning by about 3.5 percentage points. So there's a reason to not look at the polls and automatically draw a conclusion from that. And that's why you're hearing the focus on turnout. And Kristen, that's also why you're seeing some big dogs come to the state of Wisconsin as well. Tomorrow, it'll be Elizabeth Warren and Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin. We'll see Pete Buttigieg come on Friday, and then former President Obama here on Saturday. A lot of people are taking this state very seriously. Yeah,
it shows just how critical it is, a big test for Democrats, also a big test for progressives. One of the reasons why you're going to see Elizabeth Warren there. Shaq Brewster, thanks so much for your great reporting. Really appreciate it. We want to change gears now to the fight for control of the House. Joining me now is Josh Riley. He's the Democratic nominee in New York's 19th congressional district, one of the races we will be watching very closely on election night as a bellwether race. Thank you so much for joining me, Mr. Riley. Really appreciate it.
Of course. Happy to be here with you, Kristen.
So let's just talk about the climate right now across the country. Our latest poll shows that Republicans seem to have the momentum right now, seem to have the edge. Even President Biden seemed to acknowledge that, saying he thinks ultimately it's going to shift back to Democrat side. But I wonder why you think that is. Do you think it's due to a failure of messaging or policy on the part of Democrats? And how do you turn it around?
Yeah, well, I'd have to object to the premise of the question, at least based on what we're seeing here in our district. We have a lot of enthusiasm behind our campaign, and we have all along. And, I think one thing that's been consistent with this race, I can't speak to others, but at least with ours, this is a campaign about justice and jobs. People often ask me, usually reporters, is this race about the economy or abortion? And my answer is always yes. It's about justice and jobs. Justice because we've seen fundamental rights ripped away. We've seen democracy hanging by a thread. And at the same time, we have seen working families in this district and across the country really struggling to get by. In my district here in upstate New York, we've lost tons of good manufacturing jobs over the years. Those jobs have been shipped overseas. And so this race is about jobs and justice. And that's what we've been focused on and will continue to focus on.
Well, and we're going to talk about all of those issues. Let's start with the issue of crime. This has been a central issue in your race. Your Republican opponent, Republican groups have been running attack ads against you, saying you'll be soft on crime. How do you respond to voters who may have those concerns that you won't be tough enough on some of the crime issues?
Yeah, look, this is, I'm running against a 30-year career politician who is doing what career politicians do best, which is lie and take a whole bunch of money from dark money super PACs to spread those lies. And voters here are smart and they see through it. I'm running a campaign that's hopeful and optimistic. I'm not taking any corporate PAC money.
What have you done, though, and what can you point to say you're going to be tough on this issue?
Yeah, let me tell you three things. Number one, I come from a law enforcement family. My mom served in law enforcement for nearly 2 decades. Mom, if you're watching, I'm not going to defund you. Number two, I have a 2-year-old son. I want nothing more in this world than for him to be safe and secure. And the idea that I'm going to put families at risk is frankly so absurd and offensive when I myself am a dad. And third, I have a proven track record on these issues. I served as counsel in the United States Senate on the Judiciary Committee, where I brought Democrats and Republicans together to pass legislation to provide more funding, more support for law enforcement. Things like the Bulletproof Vest Partnership Program, crisis intervention training, legislation that was supported by the National Association of Police Organizations, the National Sheriff's Association. Let me say this too, I'm endorsed by law enforcement. So if this is the fight that my opponent wants to pick, if he thinks he can take a $4 million check from some dark money super PACs and spread lies about me and my record, he's in for a rude awakening.
Let me follow up with you. You raised the defund movement. Do you think some of the Democrats who touted that and called for defunding the police made a mistake in messaging and one that, frankly, candidates like yourself may still be paying for?
Yes. It was one of the stupidest things to have ever come out of anybody's mouth, Democrat or Republican.
Okay. Well, look, let me talk bigger picture here, or statewide, I should say. And crime is obviously one of the top issues in the gubernatorial race next month. And the current governor, Kathy Hochul, and Lee Zeldin have a debate tonight, as you know. Do you think Governor Hochul has done a good enough job as governor on this issue of crime?
I can't necessarily speak to everything that's going on at the state level. I think improvements need to be made, clearly. We have a lot of state policies that are not working and they need to be improved. That's true with respect to criminal justice issues. That's true with respect to cost of living. It's true with respect to a whole bunch of things. What I can tell you, because I'm running for Congress at the federal level, is that I will continue to do what I did in the past, which is support legislation to make sure that our law enforcement have the support they need. Things like the Bulletproof Vest Partnership Program and other things. I have a proven track record on this, and I'll continue that fight in Congress.
Let me ask you, because we're running out of time, and I do have a couple more questions I want to get to on the issue of abortion. What limits do you believe should exist on abortion rights, if any?
Yeah, great question. This is really important because it's a big contrast with my opponent, who is anti-choice and who insists that politicians in the states should make these decisions. Let me be very clear on this. Women's healthcare decisions are women's healthcare decisions. I trust women to make those decisions. I do not trust politicians. We should get politicians the hell out of the OBGYN's office and trust women to make their own healthcare decisions.
And what limits do you think there should be, though?
It's not for me to draw the lines and do this. I'm a man and I'm running for Congress. Women get to decide that. I don't get to decide that.
Okay.
Women do.
Okay, let me ask you, as you know, January will mark 20 years for House Speaker Nancy Pelosi leading the House Democratic Caucus. If you do make it to Congress, would you back her staying in control of the House?
I'm going to approach that question the exact same way I'm going to approach every single question that comes before me when I'm in Congress, which is what is going to be best for working folks across upstate New York. And so my plan is with every vote, every leadership vote, look at all the options, have all the conversations I need to have. And at the end of the day, whatever is going to create jobs in upstate New York, whatever is going to strengthen the middle class in upstate New York, that's how I'm going to make that decision.
Let me try one more time. If you had to make the vote today, because the election's in just 2 weeks and voters might want to know, will you back House Speaker Nancy Pelosi staying in a leadership position, whether Democrats still control the House or whether she becomes minority leader?
I'll need to have conversations with everybody who's considering running, and those conversations are going to start and end with me saying, what are you going to do to help me deliver for upstate New York? And I don't care whether you're a Democrat or a Republican or an independent. I don't care whether you're a career politician or a newcomer like me. My question is, regardless of where you come from, what are you going to do to help me help upstate New York?
Okay, Josh Riley, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, happy to do it. Thanks so much for having me.
And we do want to note that we also reached out to the Republican candidate for New York's 19th District, Mark Molinaro, to join us on Meet the Press Now, but did not hear back. Coming up, we are just hours away from what is probably the most closely watched debate. The panel will be here with much more on that. And speaking of Pennsylvania, Meet the Press Now is hitting the road again. Chuck will be talking to voters, candidates, and officials tomorrow on a special edition of Meet the Press Now, live from Pittsburgh. You do not want to miss that. That's tomorrow, right here. Welcome back. We are just a few hours from tonight's high-stakes Senate debate in battleground Pennsylvania. As we mentioned earlier, Democrat John Fetterman's team is trying to lower expectations, and Republicans are funneling more than $6 million to Oz, going all in on the state they see as key to winning control of the Senate. Joining me now is our panel, Washington Post congressional reporter Marianna Sotomayor, Navin Nayak, president and executive director of the Center for American Progress Action Fund, and Republican strategist Jim Dornan. Thanks so much to all of you for being here. And we have a hefty plate to get through, so let's dive in. Let's talk about the stakes tonight. What does each candidate need to do? Marianna, what are you going to be watching for?
I mean, all eyes are going to be on Fetterman, right? Mm-hmm. He has already set expectations pretty low, kind of putting out a statement saying, listen, I have gone through a lot. There are things that, you know, you're going to likely see. I might trip up, essentially. We've had that conversation. But you know what? I'm still going to win this race. But you don't want to find yourself in a position where you have to set expectations pretty low for viewers. Yeah. So he's already coming in at a time where you just don't want to be. So it'll be interesting to see also how Oz kind of plays that game as well. Does he, like we were talking a little bit earlier, does he mention health? What is he going to talk about? How hard does he go against Fetterman on those things?
Strategy is going to be a real challenge. I think you're absolutely right, Marianna, for Dr. Oz. Jim, weigh in here, because we saw, for example, Herschel Walker set expectations heading into his debate. He really lowered them. He said, this guy's a great talker. You're going to hear all sorts of fancy words. I'm going to show up and do my best. And then when he came out of the debate, by all accounts, a lot of people felt as though he'd held his own or won. What does Oz need to do, and what does Fetterman need to do?
So if I'm Oz, I stay away from the health issue.
Stay away from it altogether.
It's baked in. Everybody knows what's going on with it. And I would be talking to suburban women in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia about crime and inflation. That's all I would be talking to, who I would be talking to during the entire debate. And because those are going to be the key voters in that state. I mean, he's got rural voters. He's got the Trump voters. He doesn't have suburban women yet, and that's going to be the key.
Navin, what does Fetterman need to do in order to get those?
Well, first, I actually think in terms of Dr. Oz, I actually don't think he has another card to play but the health one.
So you think he's going to bring it up?
I think this whole race for the last few weeks has pivoted around Fetterman's health, and because Oz doesn't have a substantive case to make, and if this is a substantive debate about abortion, even about crime, actually Fetterman has been really effective. You know, he carries on his arm tattooed the murders that happened in Braddock. He's not going to take a back seat to Dr. Oz on the issue of who's going to keep his community safe. And so I actually think that if this stays to substance and really we focus on how extreme, Oz has been pivoting to try and be the moderate. His policy positions are incredibly extreme. He's embraced denying the election. He's embraced a ban on abortion. And so I actually think that's where Fetterman has to take the conversation.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see what they both do. Let's take a look at what happened at last night's big debate in Florida. Of course, I'm talking about the one between DeSantis and Charlie Crist. And what you saw was this extraordinary moment where Charlie Crist really pressed DeSantis. Will you commit to 4 years in office? Let's take a look at that.
Ron, you talk about Joe Biden a lot. I understand. You think you're going to be running against him. I can see how you might get confused. But you're running for governor. You're running for governor, and I have a question for you. You're running for governor. Why don't you look in the eyes of the people of the state of Florida and say to them, if you're reelected, you will serve a full 4-year term as governor? Yes or no? Yes or no, Ron? Will you serve a full 4-year term if you're reelected governor of Florida? It's not a tough question. It's a fair question. He won't tell you.
We did not agree on the candidates asking each other questions.
Time? Well, listen, I know that Charlie's interested in talking about 2024 and Joe Biden, but I just want to make things very, very clear. The only worn-out old donkey I'm looking to put out to pasture is Charlie Crist.
It was really the moment of the debate. Jim, what did you make of it? Was it a smart response by DeSantis? He still didn't answer that question.
No, he didn't, and he probably shouldn't. It's the only thing Charlie's got right now, with all due respect. I mean, it's slipping away from him. Even the national folks know that. So I think that's the one issue he can nail the governor on, and he did. He did a very good job of it. But it's not going to make any difference ultimately.
Navin, what did you make of this moment where you have Chris pressing him basically on his presidential ambitions in 2024? Does it speak to the fact, this broader idea that the race is slipping away, as Jim says, that Florida is increasingly becoming less of a purple state and more of a red state?
I guess. I think it actually kind of unveiled just how dishonest DeSantis is, right? He's tried to portray himself as a straight talker. He's going to be, direct. It was a really simple question, and he could have answered it in an honest way. I don't know. It's something I'll consider. But I'm right now focused on being governor of Florida and winning again. And it could have been a moment to just show he's a different kind of politician. Instead, he just reminded, I think, voters that he's actually pretty dishonest.
Marianna, what did you make of the moment? And to some extent, are voters' opinions baked in the cake at this point, particularly where you have a race like this, which is not as close as some of the others that we're watching?
Yeah, it was an awkward moment. He could have said, here's my focus, or, I'm the one on the ballot this year. I know he did try and say, it's 2022. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. But I'm a Florida girl, born and raised, and a lot of people, including independents, lean Democrats, they like DeSantis. They're saying, you know what, if he runs in 24, I actually prefer him more than Trump. He's similar to Trump. He kind of has those conservative values, but he is not Trump. That's something that a lot of voters in Florida like about him. So it is pretty baked in the cake. It's Charlie Crist. A lot of Floridians talk about how he's not that great of a candidate. He's switched a number of parties, right? So
that's one of his biggest challenges.
Very, allegiant to him.
Yeah.
So,
and he's run for a ton of offices, too.
Exactly. Yes, he has been governor.
That's for sure. One of the things I think that's fascinating about this moment, when you're thinking about some of these key battleground states in Pennsylvania, for example, and Wisconsin, Mandela Barnes, is it's not just a test of will Democrats or Republicans win control of Congress. It's also a real test for some of these progressive candidates, Navin, because we've seen in past races, and of course the criticism that progressives are always dealing with from their own party is, are they electable in a general election? What happens with Fetterman and Mandela Barnes, I think, may tell us a lot.
Yeah, I actually think, and the fact that both of these candidates are, either leading or neck and neck in states that are 50-50 states, right? These are not states that a progressive or Democrat should absolutely be running away with. It's a tough year for Democrats. And the fact that both of them have a real shot at winning in tough Midwestern states, I think it also underscores that I think the place where a lot of progressive candidates have an advantage is on a populist economic message. And you've seen both Mandela Barnes and John Fetterman lean into that. And I think it'll really, pave a way forward for Democrats in these kinds of states.
Jim, if we see one of these progressive candidates, either Fetterman or Mandela Barnes, pull out a win, what does that say to Democrats and to Republicans more broadly?
Well, I think that midterms are traditionally about turnout. So, it means that the Democrats did a really good job of turning out their vote. And it also means that we had some challenged candidates, and we do. Mitch was right. There were... I could go through the whole list of them, and I'll probably drum myself out of my party if I do that on television. But what I'm saying is that we have some weak guys, and Fetterman and Barnes are good candidates.
Yeah. Let me read something that progressive Democrats sent this letter yesterday to the president, calling for U.S. negotiation with Russia to end the war in Ukraine. And today, Marianna, they actually withdrew it. What's the impact of that? Does it make progressives look unprepared, not tuned into this moment and where the broader kind of U.S. policy is on this critical issue?
I was texting with House Democrats and aides all this morning, and they were angry. And progressives were angry at Jayapal for putting out that letter. A lot of the blame, I know the statement that came out said this was a staffer mistake. Behind the scenes, a lot of people are blaming her, and she has ambitions to run for leadership and also potentially run again for progressive chair. And I've had some people tell me she just blew her chances because she didn't go back and check in with the people who signed over the summer to say, hey, I'm putting this out. So there's that internal politics. But even the bigger picture, since I've been covering these House races, is the class of 2018 was the majority makers for the Democrats. You saw the squad come in. You saw the liberal wing, a lot of attention to them because they really were able to gin up the base and turn out a lot of Democrats in historic margins. But the real majority makers were those moderate frontline Democrats who right now are fighting the tough fight, trying to stay in the races. And I think that Democrats, regardless of what the results will be, will have to have a moment of reflection and say, what is a takeaway for our party and what's the pathway for keeping the majority longer than just 2 terms.
Well, Marianna's reporting is fantastic on this, Navin. What are the potential implications for these progressive candidates? They weren't a part of sending that letter out and then pulling it back, which is almost worse. But does it cast a cloud?
My hope, again, I think the hope is that this is a one-day story. I think the Congresswoman has done the right thing, I think, in retracting it and trying to move forward, recognizing, and of all of the issues going on right now, I mean, you know, I think Ukraine is low on the list of what's actually going to drive the election turnout. No. So in the short term, it just doesn't feel like it'll be that consequential 14 days from now.
Jim, final question to you quickly. President Biden has said that Republicans do have the momentum right now, but he thinks it's going to shift back. As you watch these final 14 days, what's the X factor that you think could happen to actually make that happen?
If Trump gets involved, I think that's going to be a problem. And right now he's being quiet, thank God. But I think that I think the Republicans right now, their messaging is going well. They see they have their eyes on the prize, and they're moving in the direction they need to be moving in. And they're concentrating on the issues that need to be concentrated on. But there's always that X factor, you know, and these polls are crazy too. I mean, sorry.
No, that's great. No, that's great.
I just heard in my ear, gotta go.
Thank you all. What a great conversation. Thank you. We covered a lot of ground. Marianna, Navin, and Jim, thank you. And up next, a really serious conversation, anti-Semitism in America. We will examine the disturbing trend in pop culture and politics and what it means more broadly. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Adidas announced today that the company is cutting ties with Ye, the rapper and business mogul formerly known as Kanye West. After his recent series of anti-Semitic comments, the company released the following statement. Adidas does not tolerate anti-Semitism and any other sort of hate speech. Ye's recent comments and actions have been unacceptable, hateful, and dangerous, and they violate the company's values of diversity and inclusion, mutual respect and fairness. The move comes after the company faced increased pressure to respond to Ye's conduct, especially after other businesses cut ties with him. And it comes as anti-Semitism is becoming increasingly prevalent nationwide. There were more than 2,700 anti-Semitic incidents last year alone. That's according to the Anti-Defamation League. That's a 34% increase over the previous year. And most incidents the ADL has reported in a single year since it began keeping track in the 1970s. And hate speech has also become increasingly frequent on the campaign trail, with multiple candidates and officials using anti-Semitic tropes and racist language at rallies and online. Joining me now is my colleague Joshua Johnson, host of Now Tonight with Joshua Johnson here on NBC News Now. Joshua, so good to see you. Thank you for joining us for this important discussion.
My pleasure, Kristen. Good to see you.
So just set the table for us, if you will. Here we are talking about Kanye West and these anti-Semitic comments, and obviously you have businesses cutting ties with him. But why does this moment matter?
Well, I think it might matter for a different reason because it's Kanye. And forgive me for making him exceptional, but I think, excuse me, I think he brings something unique to this. Remember back in 2005 when NBC Universal held a benefit for Hurricane Katrina, and he was standing next to Mike Myers and made headlines by saying, George Bush doesn't care about black people? Remember that? Mm-hmm. Or 2009 at the MTV Video Music Awards when Taylor Swift won the Best Female Video of the Year, and Kanye rushed the stage, took the mic from her, and said it should have been Beyonce who was nominated for Single Ladies Put a Ring on It. I think Kanye West is one of those people who, quite frankly, could only exist when he came up. Because I think he came up in an era where consumers and companies had a very different relationship. And being that kind of a provocateur didn't have social media and the kind of two-way conversation where the public could say, oh, hell no, you can't do that and keep getting our dollars. So now it's made it very easy for two companies who already had frayed relationships with Kanye, Gap and Adidas, to let him go. Remember, the Gap deal was already being unwound a month ago before it decided to drop him with today's announcement. Adidas had already been reviewing the deal. They announced a few weeks ago that they were going to review their relationship with Kanye after he had been publicly criticizing its CEO, Casper Rohrstedt, including on social media. So I think anti-Semitism is one issue. This might be more of a business story. And I think it's easier than ever now for businesses to say, we've had enough. We're done with you. Please say whatever you have to say with someone else's brand on your shirt.
Yeah, and I think it does raise questions about how quickly those businesses respond, and it does make you think about kind of the intersection of where celebrity talk versus language that you hear from politicians comes into play. Let me just let you listen to something. This is Jonathan Greenblatt, the CEO of the Anti-Defamation League, and he explained to Kara Swisher yesterday why he thinks that the language from Kanye West is so dangerous. Take a listen.
An environment where we were just saying anti-Semitism is empirically on the rise, where Jews already feel a degree of anxiety about what's happening on college campuses and workplaces, just in public spaces. He is adding a kind of fuel to the fire that should have everyone alarmed.
Right.
It's not normal. It's not okay.
And, you know, Joshua, because of who Kanye West is, we started to see, for example, this display in Los Angeles saying Kanye was right, people echoing it. You hear the concern there about the potential ripple effects of that kind of language.
Yeah, officials in Los Angeles are still investigating that. I'm not sure what they can actually do, but there was that banner that was hung over the 405 expressway that said Kanye was right about the Jews. This is after a number of communities in LA and Miami Beach had been seeing more anti-Semitic literature. I think another piece of this is that intersection between celebrity and politics. Remember, our last president was a celebrity who became a politician. Dwayne Johnson, who just released his new movie Black Adam, again had to answer questions. You sure you're not running for president? And he said, no, the job I really want is a dad. But I think today the veil has been kind of torn between professional public servants and people who are famous just because they got on NBC. And the power of someone like Kanye to influence politics, who, again, a few weeks ago was hanging out with Candace Owens, a conservative commentator, who was at a fashion show with hoodies that said White Lives Matter. That intersection is so tight right now in ways that go way beyond sort of the Charles Foster Kane imaginations of pop culture in the past. And so the line has to be drawn more carefully. I don't know that organizations like the ADL or political parties or even we as a society have quite figured out how to draw that line with social media and everything else, but we're going to have to figure it out quickly.
One of the things, and you talk about the intersection of celebrity and politics, you think about some of the anti-Semitic, some of the language that has been called racist, language that we have heard from politicians, and I'm not going to get into specific names, but sometimes they are presented in the form of dog whistles. In other words, not overt. And so it allows the person to kind of say, well, I didn't mean what you think I said. In some ways, Joshua, can that be more dangerous? I mean, is it not giving a green light to some of these hate groups?
Oh, yeah. Because that's the power of a dog whistle, right? Is, you know, someone else says it's obvious what we heard, and the person says, I didn't hear anything. You're just making this up. They didn't actually say that. They didn't actually mean that. Maybe you're being too sensitive. That's the power of a dog whistle. And I think it kind of opens the door for all kinds of other dehumanizing conversations to happen. I would think, though, going back to the panel you just had and the conversation about Ron DeSantis and Charlie Crist, I think that the midterms will show us a lot about how the Republican Party in particular views some of the values of its candidates, because there have been a number of dog whistles among GOP candidates in this midterm, and I have a feeling that Republicans would much rather retake control of Congress by any means necessary with whoever goes in the chair. And if that's the case, we're going to have a very different political story to tell in 2023.
We sure will. A lot to watch in just 2 weeks. Joshua Johnson, thank you so much for your insights, as always. And, of course, you can always catch Joshua Johnson on his show Now Tonight. That's weekdays at 8 p.m. on NBC News Now. After the break, falling behind, new NBC reporting on the challenges facing America's military. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. New figures from the U.S. Army show a serious recruitment problem. NBC News Pentagon correspondent Courtney Kube takes a look.
In the fight to win recruits, the U.S. Army fell short this year, something leaders like Army Secretary Christine Wormuth have warned about for months.
I would say we're about 12 to 15,000 recruits short this year.
According to new figures, the Army missed its target by 25%. Following the terror attacks on 9/11, a flood of Americans raised their right hand to serve. But after 2 decades of American troops in war zones, this year has been what Wormuth deemed the most challenging recruiting year since the end of the draft.
What are some of the biggest concerns that recruits have when they come in and talk to you about potentially enlisting?
The biggest concern really is deploying. They're afraid of deploying, am I going to go to Russia to deploy and stuff like that?
A lot of people are still thinking about 20 years of being at war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And obviously, a lot of parents had concerns about the idea of sending their child off to war. We've got to do a better job of telling the Army story so that we can change some of those outdated perceptions.
Now a pilot program at Fort Drum is doing just that.
So I'm on Twitter. I get a note from a teacher down in Wallenpaupack, Pennsylvania, and she was like, well, can you help us with a class, for leader development?
General Beagle did more than that, inviting Sarah Rosencrantz and her students to visit the base.
Got it.
Small groups of students, teachers, and counselors visit Fort Drum to learn about the Army. For many, this is their first exposure to military life beyond what they know from pop culture.
There's a lot of perceived notions, from what they see on TV.
And they come in and see that you have over 150 job specialties. They're blown away, anywhere from veterinarian to lawyer.
And their brainchild is growing, with other bases around the country creating their own mentor programs. Another recruiting challenge, only 23% of Americans are even eligible to serve. At Fort Jackson, the Future Soldier Prep Course is helping struggling recruits.
We have some young men and women that want to serve, that have some challenge on the academic and physical side, and what we want to do is give them that opportunity.
This 90-day mini boot camp helps potential recruits meet Army standards. About 3/4 of these students eventually qualify to ship to boot camp. But the Army chief says over time, today's recruiting shortfalls will impact readiness.
We have the soldiers that we need to do to protect the nation. What I'm concerned is long term. I'm looking over the next 2 to 3 years.
Some members of Congress have questioned the Pentagon's priorities and whether they are hurting recruiting.
We got time to embrace critical race theory at West Point, to embrace socialism at the National Defense University, to do mandatory pronoun training. The Biden administration is trying to destroy our military by force-feeding it wokeism.
Another friction point, the mandatory COVID vaccine. Pentagon leaders insist it's necessary to maintain readiness, but the Army alone has discharged nearly 1,800 soldiers for refusing the vaccine.
What we need to focus on the Army is remaining apolitical and underscoring to Americans that they can have confidence that our Army is loyal to the Constitution of this country, not to a particular political party.
Joining me on set now is Courtney Kube. Courtney, it's such a fantastic report, and you lay out the complexities so well. So big picture here, looking forward, what is the Army doing right now to address these recruitment challenges?
So among the things they're doing is historically high recruiting bonuses. Mm-hmm. So in some cases, and it's not just the Army, in some cases they're offering over $100,000 to young men and women who are willing to sign up. In addition to that, they are really expanding their marketing and their advertising, and they are targeting the influencers, the parents, the guidance counselors, the kind of people who could influence a young man or a woman to decide to enlist.
Yeah, because the point was made that so often it's the parents who have real concerns about sending their kids off. Is this just an issue that the Army is dealing with, or is this broader?
Not at all. So every service really struggled this year, in this fiscal year, to meet their recruiting goals. A number of them were able to reach into their delayed entry pool. So these are people who've signed up but haven't yet shipped to boot camp. They're able to grab some of those people and to make their recruiting numbers by using those individuals. But the reality is, because it was such a tough recruiting year for all the services, every single one of them is starting off in a tougher position this year than they did last year.
Well, it's such an incredible report, and I know you will stay on top of it, and we will look forward to your update. Courtney, thank you so much.
Thanks.
Good to see you. Still to come, the president gets boosted and makes a new push in the fight against COVID-19. We'll have the latest details, plus new insight into COVID's impact on the classroom. That's after a quick break. Stay with us. Welcome back. President Biden received his second booster shot earlier this afternoon, urging Americans to get boosted to prevent the spread of Omicron variants as the cold weather arrives. Periodic boosters are one reminder of the lingering impact of the pandemic. The continuing educational fallout is another one. In fact, a new national study done by the Department of Education, known as the Nation's Report Card, reveals what parents and teachers across the country had suspected, that students are now significantly behind in school. This report was last conducted in 2019, right before the pandemic. And since then, student test scores for math and reading declined in a majority of states. The drop is particularly shocking in math. Across the country, math scores saw their largest decline in the history of the report, dropping 8 points among 8th graders in 51 states and jurisdictions. Reading scores were marginally better, but reverted back to levels last seen in the early 90s, down 3 points among 8th graders in 33 states and jurisdictions. To break down what this all means for students and parents and how we can address it moving forward, I'm joined now by Peggy Carr, Commissioner of the National Center for Education Statistics, the branch of the Department of Education in charge of administering this assessment. Thank you so much for joining me. As we said at the top, this is what parents suspected, but what was your reaction when you first saw these numbers?
Well, we knew that we were going to see declines, and they were going to be steeper in math. But quite honestly, I was shocked at the widespread nature and how steep the declines were for students in the 8th grade. That is a key point for students' entry into high school. So it's got us all sort of stumped and worried here.
Well, practically speaking, what does this mean for students and what needs to happen to basically close that education gap? How do teachers and educators and parents make sure that they get up to speed to where they need to be?
Well, it has knocked a whole generation of students off their base. They're not on track like they were before for STEM-related course taking in math, reading, science. This is important for us to be competitive in the world. But you know, the good news is, if there's any good news out of this, is that we know what works. We know the strategies that are effective, that have science behind them, evidence-based strategies, double dose tutoring. We're going to have more time on task after school. Students may not like it, but they're going to have to go to summer school. And parents need to understand that this is serious. This is not a small decline. This is historic.
Do you have a sense of how many years it might take to close that gap for the students? You're talking about students going to summer school for the next year, the next several years. What are you anticipating?
We are anticipating really a long time, not just months. It may take a year, maybe more, but that is assuming that we put all of the resources and the knowledge base that we have with what works with the student who will benefit most. We need to be in it for the long haul, but only if we work together as partners, all levels of government, all levels of the public sector, faith-based organizations. We all have to have a contribution to helping these students get back on track. It can be done. There are some bright spots in what we saw even in these data for reading, for example. And that's because everyone pulled together at a time of severe crisis for the nation.
Look, we also saw proof in this data that the pandemic did, in fact, exacerbate education disparities in race and learning performance. So how do you factor that in?
Well, you know what? It means we can't return to normal because normal isn't where we want to be for many students who are already struggling and barely keeping afoot. Prior to the pandemic, students at the 10th and 25th percentile, they were struggling. And what this pandemic has done is widen already unacceptable gaps between these students and their higher performing counterparts.
You know, schools did receive about $122 billion from the American Rescue Plan. That was back in April. Has that money been appropriately used by school districts? Do school districts need more? Was it enough?
Well, you know, we are encouraging school districts to take a look at that minimum 20% that's required. We don't think it's going to be enough. We think school districts need to take a quick assessment of what they're using these funds for and maybe reallocate them. Let's use these funds for what they really were intended to do to help students get back on track. And the focus really should be on more than just academics. We're finding there are social emotional problems with students that we really hadn't anticipated, mental health issues. Students are really having problems with bullying more than they had before, behavioral problems. So all of it together, if we can put all of these strategies together, they're going to do nothing but help the academic part.
Peggy Carr, thank you so much for your insights. We really appreciate it. And thank you. And thank you for being with us this hour. Chuck will be back tomorrow with a very special edition of Meet the Press Now, live from Battleground, Pennsylvania. NBC News Now coverage continues with Tom Costello.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.